The crystal chandeliers blazed inside the Grand Hall of the Plaza Hotel, New York, their light scattering like 1,000 shards of glass ringing out into an invisible symphony. The string orchestra blended with the clinking of glasses and bursts of laughter, weaving everything into a dazzling, triumphal chorus. Yet at the very center of that luxurious tableau, Edward Hamilton remained silent, like a discordant note. At 40, the CEO of Hamilton Financial sat upright in his leather chair, his gaze neither lifted to the dance of chandeliers above nor drawn to the glittering footsteps crossing the red carpet. Before him lay an engagement card printed on ivory paper, its silver border cold and sharp, cutting into the air like a blade. He looked, he searched, he longed. At first, he looked at the card as though hunting for an escape. Then he searched his mind for 100 reasons to excuse himself, to avoid facing the invitation. And finally, he longed for an anchor, a lifeline, something to pull him out of the whirlpool of pride and pain. But all he found was emptiness. The music swayed softly as if to soothe. Yet inside Edward, another sound rose, the sound of memory, the sound of challenge. He recalled the mocking eyes of a few old friends, their words sweet as poison. "Edward, you won't dare show up. You always run away." Above all, he saw the smirk of his younger brother, Daniel Hamilton, that half-smile steeped in arrogance. Just that thought wrapped Edward's chest in steel. His chest tightened, his hands trembled, his pride was torn apart. That card was not sharp enough to end him in one cut, but sharp enough to slice him slowly, each wound lingering like shards of glass pressing beneath the skin. Not enough to kill, but enough to bleed him of his pride piece by piece. Amid the noise of the banquet hall, Edward felt like a castaway stranded in a sea of people. He was the emperor of a financial empire, yet in this moment, he seemed more like a prisoner shackled within light and sound. The entire opulent hall was nothing but a gilded cage, and he realized if he did not rise, if he did not seize a decision, he would drown in the very world he had built. He closed his eyes. A whisper from deep within echoed, "No retreat, no surrender. Daniel must not believe I have given up." Those words pounded through his mind, like a hammer striking a glass wall again and again. And in that breathless moment, an idea flared mad, yet alive. He would not go alone. He would step into that party with someone by his side, an unexpected presence, a figure whose appearance would silence the room. He did not yet know whose face it would be, nor who fate might place beside him. But he knew one thing for certain: he needed someone, an anchor, a salvation, to prove to the world that Edward Hamilton had not fallen. The music still lingered, the light still blazed. Yet to Edward, it all blurred away, leaving only the small card on the table. Its cold silver border reflected a narrow streak of light, splitting the air like an invisible slash. That image etched itself into him, like dried blood carrying the faint tang of rust, leaving behind a slow-burning ache in his heart. The high-rise office of Edward Hamilton inside the Hamilton Financial Headquarters looked straight down at Central Park. At night, the city stretched out before him like a black velvet canvas studded with flickering shards of crystal. On ordinary days, that view gave him a sense of triumph. But tonight, those lights were nothing more than cold fractures, illuminating the loneliness gnawing inside his chest. He sat motionless in the leather armchair, his hand still gripping the silver card. The small piece of cardstock bore a weight as heavy as a whetstone grinding against bone. On the paper, the black ink confirmed an irreversible truth: the engagement of Daniel Hamilton and Veronica Stone. Edward looked. Edward searched. Edward longed. First, he stared at the words, hoping they would blur and fade away. Then he searched his mind for an escape, a reasonable excuse to decline. But there was nothing but emptiness. And finally, he longed for an anchor, a salvation, something strong enough to pull him out of the consuming sense of defeat. "I cannot let Daniel see me falter. The thought snapped into his mind like a taut string pulled past its limit. I cannot let the world think Edward Hamilton is afraid. He remembered the mocking eyes of those who once called him friend, the sly smile Daniel had flashed during the family meeting when he deliberately brought up Edward's past failure. All of it merged, pounding against him like war drums, driving him to the wall. If he entered the party alone, he would be the solitary man, the perfect target for pity. If he had brought a familiar face from high society, he would have looked desperate, like a cheap act. Not enough to inspire admiration, but just enough to make him a joke. He needed another choice, something no one would see coming. A presence strong enough to flip the game the moment he walked through those doors. Edward rose, striding toward the vast pane of glass. His reflection overlapped the city's lights. In the mirrored surface, he didn't see a powerful leader, but a man wrestling with shame and pride. Deep lines furrowed his forehead, his teeth clenched tight. I will not go alone, he whispered, but the words echoed like a vow. If I must face them, then I will face them in a way that makes every head bow. He returned to the desk and placed the card down. The sharp paper edge sliced his fingertip, leaving a thin scratch. Not enough to cause searing pain, but enough to remind him that silence, too, was a form of bleeding. The thought that had first flickered deep inside him had now hardened into resolve. He would find a companion outside the mold, not the polished beauty from a magazine cover, nor the female partners of the financial elite, but someone no one would expect a choice so daring that every gaze would be drawn to him. Rhetorical questions spun through his mind in a relentless loop. If I dare to break every rule, can I reclaim the upper hand? If I bring someone from outside this world, will that false wall crumble? If I walk beside an unexpected figure, will Daniel still wear that arrogant smile? He knew the answers would not come easily, but he was certain of one truth: better to risk everything than to endure. Better to lay his cards on the table than to sit still and watch the game end in failure. Outside, the lights of New York still flickered, both dazzling and indifferent. Inside Edward, another rhythm had taken shape, slow at first, then faster, then erupting. From tonight on, the game will no longer follow the old rules. The New York night was heavy with cold air, winds sweeping in from the Hudson River across rain-soaked streets. Edward Hamilton stepped out of the high-rise building, leaving behind the dim yellow glow spilling from his office. With his collar pulled up, he merged into the chaotic stream of people at Grand Central Station, where lives crowded together in the rush of survival. He had no concrete plan. He only knew he needed something unexpected, a presence no one could predict, an arrival that would make every gaze falter. That thought urged him forward, the sound of his leather shoes striking evenly against the wet pavement, echoing like the drums of fate. Then he saw her. A woman sat curled on the station steps, her tangled hair falling across her thin cheekbones. The old coat she wore wasn't enough to keep her warm, and her hands clutched tightly around a faded cloth bag. Light from a towering billboard spilled down, painting her face half in brightness, half in shadow. But in her eyes, deep as a winter lake, there was something that made Edward stop in his tracks. He looked. He searched. He longed. He looked to make sure she wasn't just another shadow on the street. He searched for the reason his heart trembled, and he longed to hold on to this moment, as if fate itself had reached out its hand at just the right time. Edward stepped closer. His voice was deep, no longer carrying the tone of a CEO, but the weight of a man willing to gamble. I need someone to go with me tonight. The woman lifted her head. Her sharp gaze swept over him, as if scanning a stranger who had trespassed into her guarded world. She answered, her voice hoarse yet steady. You look at me like an experiment. Edward froze for a moment. Those words were precise, sharp as a blade. He pressed his lips together, then replied, maybe, but perhaps we both need a chance. Silence lingered. The loudspeaker of the station echoed with an announcement for a late train, cutting into the space between them like a countdown. The woman gripped her cloth bag tighter, her eyes still fixed on him. "You think I'll change something for you?" she asked, her voice slow but weighted with each word. "Not change." "Upend," Edward answered firmly, without hesitation. She laughed, a sound dry and brittle, like a stone striking the surface of still water. "A homeless woman, at an elite party. Are you sure you're not setting yourself up for social suicide?" Edward didn't back away. He knew this was exactly the reckless choice he had been waiting for. "If I walk in with someone like you, they'll have to look again. They'll have to ask themselves, who is she? And that's what I need." The air stretched taut. She tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with suspicion mingled with curiosity. Then, in a quiet but firm voice, she said, "I don't need anyone to save me." Edward drew a slow breath. Locking eyes with her, he realized that her words weren't mere defense. They were a declaration of pride, of scars not yet healed. He gave a small nod. "I know. I'm not looking for someone to save. I'm looking for an ally." Those words shifted the air between them. No longer a CEO facing a homeless woman, but two outcasts catching sight of each other's reflection. The station loudspeaker kept blaring, but at that moment, every sound fell away, leaving only their breaths and their eyes. The woman slowly rose to her feet. The cloth bag hung loosely at her side, her fragile shoulders straight but unyielding. She looked directly at Edward, the corner of her lips curving slightly with a hint of challenge. "Then let's see how far you dare to go." Edward nodded, inside his chest. His heartbeat pounded like the opening of a drumline. He knew this choice he had just made would change everything. The limousine quietly pulled away from Grand Central, gliding through streets awash with neon lights. Edward Hamilton sat in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the silhouette of the woman beside him. She remained silent, clutching an old fabric bag tightly as if holding onto a fragment of a life that had already been shattered. In Edward's mind, questions circled endlessly. Who was she? Why did her eyes not tremble, but remain so calm? And why did he believe she could become the key piece in tonight's game? They stopped in front of a small building in the Upper East Side, a high-end beauty salon Edward had only heard about from his female colleagues. Inside, a soft golden light spilled out, delicate as a veil draped over the space. So different from the harshness of the streets outside. The woman stepped inside, her worn-out shoes clicking dryly against the marble floor. The staff froze for a moment, their eyes mixing curiosity with doubt, but Edward gave a slight nod. A simple signal, enough for them to understand this was an order. Before the large mirror, she sat down. Her tangled hair fell across half her face, her thin hands clenched tightly on her lap. The staff hurried to prepare. As the gentle scent of perfume spread through the room, Edward stood behind her, arms crossed, his gaze following every movement. The mirror reflected an image, a woman seemingly lost between two worlds. On one side, a harsh past, and on the other, a light waiting ahead. And at that very moment, Edward understood this wasn't just about slipping into a glamorous dress. This was a ritual of rebirth. The stylist carefully combed each strand of hair, pulling it into smooth, flowing locks. With every stroke of the comb, the dust of the streets seemed to fall away. A light layer of makeup gradually traced her delicate features, each brush transforming her worn face into something sharper, elegant, yet still carrying a quiet pride. Edward watched silently, and within him rose a feeling difficult to name. It was like witnessing an old stone statue being cleaned of centuries of dust, revealing rare marble beneath. The woman said nothing. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing steady, serene, as if she had been familiar with such rituals long ago. That serenity unsettled Edward. How could someone who had lived on the streets sit so naturally under this light when the final dress was brought out, a simple yet refined black gown that embraced her form? Edward held his breath. It was as though the dress had been made for her, outlining her curves without exaggeration, alluring without needing to flaunt. When she stood up, The golden light fell across her face, and in the mirror, she reflected a completely different woman. He could not speak, but inside, the words echoed, "This is the figure I need." The woman opened her eyes and looked straight into the mirror. It was not a curious or trembling gaze, but the look of someone long accustomed to seeing herself in such spaces. A faint smile flickered, then vanished quickly, leaving behind an unreadable calm. "You want me to appear like this, don't you?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Edward replied, his tone low and deliberate. "No, this is not what I want. This is what that entire room will never expect." A short silence followed. Then she turned to him, her indifferent gaze carrying something deeper. "I don't need anyone to save me, but I will go with you. Let's see if that light is strong enough to burn through this darkness." Edward gave a slight nod. In the mirror, two figures reflected back a man struggling to hold on to his power and a woman who seemed to have stepped out of the mist of her past. They were not merely preparing for a party. They were preparing for a battle, where clothing would serve as armor, and every glance would be the first blade drawn. The evening gala at the Waldorf Astoria had begun. The grand hall was flooded with light, crystal chandeliers casting radiant beams like thousands of watchful eyes. The flashing of cameras outside along the red carpet, the hurried rhythm of high heels, and laughter woven into the backdrop of elegant music all blended into a symphony of power and prestige. The large double doors swung open. Edward Hamilton walked in, but it wasn't his entrance that made the entire hall turn. It was the woman walking beside him. Her fitted black dress, simple yet refined, reflected the light like a shimmering ribbon of silk. Her hair was neatly styled, her delicate features glowing under just the right touch of makeup. She walked next to Edward with a strange calm. No hesitation, no bowing of the head. It was as if this world had once belonged to her, and now it was simply the moment she had returned. The cameras followed. A few whispers broke out. "Who is she? I've never seen her face before. Look at the way she walks, like a true lady." Edward felt every gaze piercing into them. He knew this moment was the disruption he had wagered on. And when the woman's eyes met the room head-on, unflinching, the entire hall seemed to drop one beat. The woman needed no introduction. Her confident silence compelled others to speculate. Who was she? The daughter of a hidden dynasty, a secret star, or a piece Edward had deliberately kept concealed until now? From afar, Daniel Hamilton froze among the guests. The ever-present smile on his lips faltered for an instant. His eyes flickered quickly, first with surprise, then tightening into caution. Edward saw it all, and inside a quiet satisfaction rose. At last, he had thrown Daniel off balance. The hall buzzed louder, waves of whispers spreading, yet the woman kept her measured pace, shoulders straight. Each strike of her high heels on the marble floor echoed like the steady beat of a conductor's baton in a play. They stopped at the center of the hall, under the brightest light. Edward inclined his head in greeting, while she, the mysterious companion, only offered the faintest smile, enough to carve out a pause. No one dared ask, because at that moment, everyone was forced into anticipation, and anticipation itself was power. At this point, if you are listening to this story, ask yourself, if it were you, what would you do? Would you dare walk into a room full of judging eyes beside someone entirely unknown, relying only on the belief that your presence could change everything? Share your thoughts in the comments, for each of us holds a different answer. And sometimes, that very answer reflects our own courage or our own fear. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to The Soft Why, so we can continue exploring stories layered with meaning like this one. Edward and the woman still stood there, the central figures of a lavish painting. Every word, every gaze revolved around them. And he knew, the game had truly begun. The grand hall of the Waldorf Astoria glittered with light, but as Daniel Hamilton approached, the atmosphere seemed to sink. Guests began exchanging glances, as if they had just witnessed an unexpected act of theater and were now waiting for the next scene. Daniel, Edward's younger brother, a 35-year-old man at the height of power, wore a flawless tuxedo, his face glowing with a polished social smile. But his eyes were different, sharp, cold, probing, locked on the silhouette of the woman beside his brother. Edward and Daniel faced each other, separated only by a breath. Two brothers, two worlds, two ambitions. The murmurs behind the guests served as background music for a confrontation long predestined. "Edward," Daniel began, his smile still fixed, smooth as velvet draped over a blade. "What a surprise to see you here, and to bring along such a special guest." Edward tilted his head, his voice deep and steady. "Yes, I thought on such a significant occasion, appearing alone would be inappropriate." The woman beside him kept her gaze still, her lips curling into a faint, thin smile. Her silence stretched the air taut, forcing Daniel to continue. "But," Daniel paused, his eyes sweeping across the crowd as though sharing a sweet secret. "I've never heard of this lady in our social circles. She seems to have appeared out of thin air." Whispers spread quickly, like fire racing across dry grass. Edward held his gaze firm, his words deliberate. "Perhaps it's because you and others do not look far enough. Not everyone needs this family's approval to exist." Daniel let out a light laugh, sharp as shards of glass falling on stone. "That's my brother indeed, still fond of grand words. But Edward, we both know those not accepted by the family rarely stand long in this world." The word, soft as velvet yet cutting deep, lingered like a blade disguised as a blessing. Guests exchanged looks, some nodding knowingly, others exhaling softly. At last, the woman spoke. Her voice was not loud, yet each syllable fell with the chill of a drumbeat. "This world is not defined by your family." The entire hall fell silent. Daniel blinked, his smile stiffening for a brief second. Edward turned slightly toward her, surprised by her bluntness, yet realizing her words were the first sword unsheathed. Daniel adjusted his tie, regaining rhythm. "Such a bold declaration, but forgive me, I'm still unclear who this lady once was, or where she once belonged." The woman did not avert her gaze. Her eyes, deep and proud, held steady, cold as they were unwavering. "I was once someone who walked these very halls, but I was also once someone unaccepted. The question is, does that truly matter?" The hall trembled with unease. Her words, seemingly casual, were in fact a piercing wind, a reminder that her past was far from simple, that her presence tonight might conceal a history no one wished to revisit. Edward's hand tightened quietly. Inside his chest, pride and worry intertwined. He had taken a risk bringing her here, and now she was proving that risk was not a mistake. Daniel's smile remained, but unease flickered in his eyes. He raised his glass slightly, his voice light as if in a toast, yet each word heavy as lead. "Then let us celebrate my brother's courage. May that courage endure long enough." Sparse applause followed, but no one seemed at ease. The atmosphere in the hall hung suspended, like a taut string waiting for the next note. Edward lifted his chin, his gaze never leaving Daniel's. Beneath the chandeliers and the rising hum of whispers, the two brothers stood like duelists framed in the same picture. And everyone knew this was only the opening move. The music in the grand hall of the Waldorf Astoria suddenly shifted. After a series of lively melodies, the orchestra swelled into a slow waltz. The violin's lingering notes stretched like ribbons. The piano's soft rhythm carried them along, and each gentle beat of the drums pulsed like the heartbeat of the entire room. The atmosphere calmed, turning more romantic, yet taut as a string waiting to snap. Edward Hamilton tilted his head and extended his hand toward the mysterious woman beside him. In the glow of the chandeliers, the gesture was not merely an invitation to dance, but a silent declaration. "We are stepping into the next battlefield together." The woman looked at him. Her eyes were deep and still, like a winter lake, A brief hesitation, and then she placed her thin yet steady hand in his. That touch carried an unexpected warmth, making Edward's heart skip a beat. They walked onto the dance floor. Every gaze followed them, no longer filled with the earlier murmurs, but a heavy silence, waiting. It was as if the whole room wanted to witness what kind of play the two of them would perform next. Edward placed his hand on her waist, guiding her. The first steps were slightly stiff, but soon they blended into the rhythm. Her black dress fluttered lightly with each turn, the light shattering into streaks across the marble floor. Shoes struck in perfect time, every step like the ticking of destiny. He whispered, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You're used to this. I could tell right away." The woman gave a faint, wistful smile. "I once belonged to rooms like this, but I was also thrown out of this world, like an ink stain wiped from a white sheet of paper." Edward faltered for a moment. He tightened his grip on her hand, then released it slightly, as though afraid of breaking the fragile calm she carried. "And now, you've returned." Why? Her eyes drifted over the crowd, dozens of stares still fixed upon them, before she turned back to him. "Not to return. Just to remind them that I never disappeared." Edward's heartbeat quickened. Her words echoed in his mind like a bell. In her eyes, he saw quiet pride and a wound that had never healed. The music kept circling. They turned with it, each round pulling them closer. Edward caught the faint fragrance from her hair and heard the rhythm of her breathing blending with the music. He asked, his voice low, trembling slightly, "You're not afraid of all those eyes?" She tilted her head, lips brushing close to his ear, her voice soft but resolute. "When you've already lost everything, what is there left to fear?" Edward went still. A sensation, both aching and warm, spread through his chest. He understood she was not a card he had discovered. She was a mirror, reflecting back his own emptiness. "I don't know your name," he blurted, his gaze locked on her. "But I know this without you. I would have collapsed the moment I walked through those doors tonight." The woman didn't answer right away. She simply smiled, her eyes softening for a moment, then tightened her grip on his hand, as if to remind him, "I don't need to be saved, but I can walk with you." The music rose to its climax and ended on a long, lingering note. They stopped, breathing hard, foreheads nearly touching. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling to fill the entire room. Yet in that moment, Edward and the woman heard only their own racing heartbeats, pounding like a drum that signaled the beginning of the next chapter. The waltz had just ended, and the applause still echoed through the grand hall when conversations began to stir again. But this time, the tone was entirely different. No one was gossiping about Daniel Hamilton and his engagement anymore. Every word, every whisper now pointed toward Edward and the woman beside him. The crystal chandeliers still shone brilliantly, but the atmosphere had shifted. Where Edward stood, it was as though a magnet drew in every glance, every question, every speculation. A silver-haired investor, Mr. Harrison, stepped forward. His voice was calm, yet his eyes were sharp. "Edward, it has been a long time since you've appeared at social gatherings, and tonight, I must admit, you've surprised everyone." Edward gave a faint smile. Before he could answer, the woman tilted her head, her eyes gleaming beneath the lights, and spoke in a gentle yet unmistakably clear tone. "Surprise is the most fascinating part of this world, isn't it, Mr. Harrison? If everything could be predicted, there would be nothing worth remembering." Her voice wasn't loud, but just enough for those nearby to hear. A brief silence fell, then a few soft chuckles followed. The reply was simple, yet sharp, like planting a flag firmly on contested ground. A young businesswoman leaned in, her eyes filled with curiosity. "I've never seen you at any financial conferences. What field do you work in?" The woman smiled, unhurried. "My field doesn't exist on paper. I'm interested in values that are harder to measure, like trust. Her words fell lightly, yet they rang with weight, making several people nod. Edward glanced at her, a flicker of unease in his chest. She showed no fear and even turned the pointed question into an advantage. From across the room, Daniel frowned. He strode closer, pushing into the circle. Truly admirable. But in this world, trust usually comes hand in hand with numbers, reports, and signatures. Without them, it's very difficult to survive. The woman turned to face him, her smile unchanged. Only a shade cooler. Not everything needs a signature. Mr. Hamilton, some things exist simply because people dare to believe, not because they are forced to sign. The crowd broke into murmurs. A few glances shifted toward Daniel, probing. Clearly, the balance of the conversation had tipped. Edward remained silent at her side. He realized she didn't need him as her shield. On the contrary, her composure was making him look like a worthy companion. Inside his chest, emotions swirled: pride, mixed with a quiet jealousy. Jealousy because her brilliance drew every gaze, so much so that his presence felt dimmed. Another guest, Mr. Blake, pressed further. Fascinating. But I must ask, if you could choose one key word to define yourself in this world, which would you choose? The woman lifted her glass, touched it lightly to her lips, then set it down. Her eyes locked firmly as her voice flowed softly. My key word is freedom. One short word, yet it echoed long in the minds of everyone present. Some nodded in agreement, others flinched as if struck, and Edward felt a jolt deep inside. She had claimed the space, planting her first flag in the hearts of the entire crowd. This moment was like a chess match. Every answer was a move, and she had made consecutive plays that left her challengers unable to respond. In the eyes of those around, she was no longer an anonymous woman. She had become a dazzling enigma, a presence that demanded attention. Edward lifted his gaze, meeting countless eyes filled with curiosity, admiration, and suspicion. He knew then the game had shifted to a new board, and this woman, with just a few words, had redrawn the entire picture. The grand hall was still alive with laughter and conversation, but to Edward Hamilton, the crystal lights had become harsh spotlights, exposing every doubt that swirled around him. The woman at his side had deftly steered the conversation, drawing the crowd toward her, yet the pressure he felt kept growing heavier. Daniel Hamilton would not let him rest. While the guests were still whispering, Daniel moved closer, a thin smile on his lips. His voice was low, just loud enough for Edward to hear. Step outside with me for a moment. Without waiting for an answer, Daniel put a hand on his brother's shoulder, pressing harder than necessary. Edward understood it was not an invitation. It was a command wrapped in a polite manner. They turned into the corridor where the light was softer and the music only faintly echoed. The woman did not follow, but her eyes met Edward's before he left the hall. A brief, steady look. You are not alone. The door closed. The corridor was silent, taut like a wire about to snap. Daniel turned back. His smile fell away, revealing the coldness hidden beneath his mask. What do you think you're doing, Edward? His voice hissed, like steel scraped across stone. Bringing someone of unknown background to this party, in the middle of my engagement night. Do you want to make a mockery of everything? Edward kept his back straight, looking at his brother, his voice calm but restrained. The joke isn't on me. The joke is that you think you can control everything. Daniel gave a short, dry laugh. Control? I don't think, Edward. I've done that my whole life. And you've lived in my shadow your entire life. And now tonight you suddenly want to turn the tables. Blood rushed to Edward's face. He stepped closer, his voice hardening. Can't you see people in the hall are already shifting toward her? You no longer control the narrative. That's an illusion, Daniel cut in, his eyes flashing with anger. Who do you think she is? Some lady appearing out of nowhere who can ruin everything I built. Don't be foolish. Edward! Edward tightened his fist. Instead of cursing, he lowered his voice and spoke each word slowly. Your arrogance is what makes you weak. You want everyone to bow, but you don't realize that sometimes just one person standing tall can shake the whole room. Daniel froze for a second. Then he curled his lip, stepped in close, and whispered like a blade sliding across a throat, don't forget. Edward. She isn't a puppet you can pull the strings of. If you can't control her, both of you will sink. A suffocating pressure rose in Edward's chest, jealousy, anger, refusal. But in that moment, he remembered her look before he left the hall. You are not alone. That thought anchored his heart, keeping him from collapsing under Daniel's storm of words. He lifted his head and faced him squarely. I will not let you decide that. Not about her, and not about me. A heavy silence fell in the corridor. The music from the hall drifted faintly, fragile as a thread. The two brothers stared at each other like blades poised to cross, neither yet striking, but enough to make the air hiss. Daniel ground his teeth, then turned on his heel and left, leaving behind a cold sentence. You'll see. Edward, the cost of opposing me is higher than you think. Edward stood still, knuckles white around his clenched hand. Yet for the first time, there was a spark of resolve in his eyes. He knew the fight had grown beyond the party. From this point on, it was no longer about pride. It was about freedom, about survival. When Edward Hamilton returned to the Grand Hall, the music rose again as if there had never been a confrontation behind the corridor doors. But to him, nothing was the same anymore. The dazzling crystal light now felt no different than spotlights glaring down on a stage full of traps. The woman still stood there, calm amid circles of conversation, like a mysterious black ribbon against the golden glow of the room. Her eyes met his, quiet but steady. Edward exhaled, feeling a brief ease in his chest, but Daniel did not miss his chance. He moved into the crowd, raising his glass as if preparing to make a toast. His voice carried smoothly, polite yet loud enough to draw attention his way. Truly tonight is a memorable occasion, not only because of the engagement, but also because of the arrival of a very mysterious guest. The crowd fell silent. Daniel turned, his eyes gleaming with challenge, landing on the woman. To be honest, I tried to find out, but none of us knows anything about her. Where do you come from? Who are you? And most importantly, why appear on this very night? His words pierced the air like a needle popping into a balloon already stretched thin. Whispers stirred, heavier, quicker. The woman did not answer right away. She simply lifted her glass, turning it gently, the liquid shimmering under the light like a fragment of mirror. Then she set it down and spoke slowly. There are appearances that do not need an announcement. They happen because they must happen. Daniel gave a thin smile, his gaze sweeping the room as if sharing a secret with everyone present. But sometimes, such an appearance is not by chance. Sometimes it is arranged to cover up something else. The whispers grew louder again. Some guests glanced at Edward, others at her, eyes half curious, half suspicious. Edward felt heat rising in him, but he clenched his fist, forcing himself not to react too quickly. The woman remained composed, a faint smile flickering on her lips. Perhaps you are right, but you also know, not every arrangement is bad. Some arrangements exist to reveal the truth. Daniel paused for a moment, then smirked. If so, I hope the truth reveals itself soon, because tonight, we all deserve to know exactly who we are standing before. The atmosphere tightened like a string pulled to its limit. The music went on, but now those melodies felt like nothing more than a thin veil hiding the blades behind the smiles. Edward looked around, clearly seeing the suspicion taking root among the crowd. He wanted to speak, to defend her, but her gaze met his, quietly telling him, "Don't. Let me stand on my own." And he stayed silent. For the first time, he understood what it meant to trust. If you are listening to this, ask yourself, have you ever stood in a crowd and felt every pair of eyes filled with doubt staring at you? That feeling, both lonely and exposed, how would you face it? Share your story or your thoughts in the comments. It might be your way of letting go, or perhaps the way you find someone who has lived through the same. And don't forget to subscribe to The Soft Why, so we can walk together through stories full of scars yet holding the power to heal. In the hall, forced laughter and clinking glasses rose again. But the atmosphere had shifted. A seed of suspicion had been planted, and Edward knew this battle was far from over. The atmosphere in the grand hall seemed to thicken after Daniel Hamilton's warning. The crystal light still blazed, the music still flowed, but beneath the glitter lay hundreds of suspicious eyes and hurried whispers. The woman standing next to Edward remained outwardly calm, but he noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. A group of guests left the hall, whispering among themselves. Just a few minutes later, one of them returned, holding a thin folder in his hand. It was Mr. Maxwell, a longtime associate of the Hamilton family. Well known for always siding with the powerful, his voice rang clear, polite on the surface but carrying the scent of gunpowder in every word. I happened to receive a few reports. Perhaps everyone here will find this interesting. The murmurs grew louder. Maxwell opened the folder, pulling out a few old photographs and documents. The crystal light reflected off the images, illuminating a familiar face, the very woman standing beside Edward. But in those photos, she was neither anonymous nor an outsider. "This is the file on Isabella Carter," Maxwell declared, his tone heavy. The ex-wife of Richard Carter, a major partner who collapsed after being cut off by the Hamilton family. A silent explosion went off in Edward's mind. He felt the entire room shudder. People whispered. Voices of, "Is that true and impossible?" cut through the air. Daniel smiled, victory flickering across his lips. "So that's it. Nothing by chance. The woman you brought tonight, Edward, is the ex-wife of a man who once considered our family an enemy." Edward turned to Isabella. In her eyes, there was no denial. She simply took a breath, lifting her chin slightly. Then her voice rose, low but clear, like a river pushing through stones. "Yes, I was Richard Carter's wife, and I also lost everything when the Hamilton family set the trap that bankrupted him and destroyed his honor." The entire hall fell into silence. Her words dropped like a hammer striking glass. Some guests stood frozen, while others barely hid their excitement at the scent of scandal. Edward stepped back half a pace, his chest tightening. He remembered the long nights when Richard Carter disappeared from the financial world, the rumors, and the ruthless decisions his father had once made. Now, the pieces fell into place. So it was true. The woman had not returned merely to stand by his side, but to reclaim justice. A storm surged in Edward's chest between the trust that had just begun to grow, the doubt creeping in, and the shame of realizing his family's mistakes. Isabella looked around the hall, her voice steady, not loud but sharp with clarity. "I did not come here to beg for pity. I do not need anyone to save me. I stand here because I want the truth spoken again, in the very place it was once buried." Daniel immediately cut in with a sly smile. The truth, or just a story painted by a woman who was abandoned. Isabella turned her gaze toward him, so cold that many in the hall shivered. "If you call it abandoned, then remember, it was your family's hand behind it. And tonight, I am here to remind everyone that not all power is strong enough to hide a crime forever." The room erupted. Whispers rolled like waves. No longer restrained, Edward stood in the middle, trapped in the storm on one side, his loyalty to family on the other. The truth laid bare by the woman he had brought. He lifted a hand to his forehead, shame spreading through his chest like ink dissolving in water. All his life, he had believed he was in control of everything. Yet now he felt small before the tide of truth. The grand hall of the Waldorf Astoria still blazed under the crystal chandeliers, but the atmosphere had completely changed. After the past records were revealed, every gaze turned toward that woman, Isabella Carter, the ex-wife of Richard Carter, a victim in the power game once orchestrated by the Hamilton family. Edward Hamilton stood beside her, his heart weighed down like stone. Isabella's words still echoed in his mind. "I don't need anyone to save me. I stand here so the truth can be spoken again." He had never heard a statement so proud and yet so piercing. For a long moment, no one in the hall dared to speak. The background music seemed out of place, piano notes falling into the tense air like raindrops on cracked glass. Daniel remained silent, his eyes glowing with triumph. He believed that the exposed truth would drown Edward. But what Daniel did not expect was that this very truth would open another path. Edward turned to Isabella. His voice was low, choked as if gripped deep in his chest. "Have nothing left to justify. I have been silent for too long, and that silence turned me into an accomplice." Isabella looked at him, her eyes darkening. But within that gaze, there was no furious hatred. Only the scar of an old wound is still engraved. She quietly replied, "I never wished for you to say sorry because an apology cannot bring back the past." Edward lowered his head. The image of his father, the cold boardrooms, the handshakes traded with blood and tears, all came rushing back. Shame spread in his chest like ink seeping into water, darkening, impossible to wash away. But I know one thing. He lifted his head and locked eyes with Isabella. "From this moment on, I will not let you stand alone anymore. I am not here to save you. I am here to walk with you to the very end of the truth." A silence stretched. Guests exchanged glances, some shivering slightly at that declaration. Isabella's lips curved faintly, half smile, half sorrow. "To walk with me, you will have to stand against your own family. Are you sure you can bear that?" Edward drew a deep breath. His voice hardened, each word etched onto the marble floor. "I have stood against them from the moment I took your hand to walk into this party." Isabella's eyes flickered, then softened. She looked at him for several more seconds, as if measuring the steadiness of his words. Then she nodded, whispering, "Then we walked together." No more words were needed. An agreement had just been sealed in silence, not by paper, not by signature, but by a gaze. The guests around them still murmured, but within that ripple of whispers, a new energy began to form, the energy of a nascent alliance, one who had once been stripped of everything and one who had once stayed silent before guilt, now stood together on the side of truth. Edward felt something unfamiliar stir within his heart. For the first time in years, he did not feel like an outcast in his own family, but part of something greater, a journey toward justice. Isabella also drew a quiet, long breath. Her shoulders, always taut like a drawn bow, now seemed to release slightly. In her gaze, for the first time, appeared a fragile glimmer of warmth. The dawn in New York broke with a pale light, filtering through the glass windows of Edward Hamilton's high-rise apartment. Instead of the usual calm, that morning arrived like a storm. His phone buzzed nonstop, the screen flooded with messages, emails, and a cascade of notifications. Headlines blazed in red, one after another. CEO Edward Hamilton, hand in hand with Carter's ex-wife. Isabella Carter, the woman who returned for revenge. The Hamilton family linked to the collapse of Carter Enterprises. Edward sat upright, feeling as if he had been pulled into an abyss. Every letter dancing across the screen was like a dull blade, not sharp enough to kill, but cruel enough to slash his honor. Before he could steady himself, his inbox lit up. "If you continue to be with her, every secret of your family will be exposed. This is not a warning. This is the truth waiting." At the same time, a thick envelope was delivered to his office. Inside were photos from the gala. Edward and Isabella stepping out of the Waldorf Astoria, hand in hand. The angle was deliberately chosen to make him look blind, while she appeared to be the manipulator. On one of the photos, Someone had scribbled in jagged handwriting, "Another puppet of Carter." Edward clenched the photo, blood rushing to his temples. He didn't need to think long to know Daniel or someone in the family had orchestrated this. The strike was too familiar, filthy, but effective. In the apartment, Isabella sat quietly in the corner. She held a newspaper, eyes scanning each line, her face expressionless. When Edward slammed the stack of photos down on the table, she finally looked up. Her voice was calm, almost cold. "I have lived in the storm long enough. But you, Edward, are just stepping in." He froze, his chest tightening at the truth in her words. Then he forced a smile, his voice hoarse. "You're right. I'm not used to it, but I will be. And I swear, this time I won't run." The media storm outside only grew more violent. Article after article appeared. Television networks brought in analysts, and social media churned with rumors. From mainstream news to tabloid trash, everything pointed to one thing: Edward Hamilton being dragged by the ghost of the past, and the Hamilton family's honor on the brink of collapse. And then, an invitation appeared in Edward's mailbox. Charity gala this weekend, hosted by the Hamilton family. Beneath it, a bold line: "We hope you will attend with your special guest." Edward held the card, his hand trembling slightly. He knew this was not an invitation, but a trap laid out like a red carpet, a stage where Daniel and those behind him would script a spectacle to publicly disgrace him and Isabella. The room fell silent. Edward inhaled deeply, then let out a dry laugh. "They think they can corner me one more time." Isabella set the newspaper down, her eyes glinting with an unreadable light. "What will you do?" Edward looked up, his voice low but resolute. "I will go, not into the trap, but straight into the heart of the storm." In that moment, there was no hesitation left. In his eyes burned an unshakable resolve. Isabella looked at him and gave a slight nod. She had long been accustomed to the shadows, while he was just stepping in. But this time, they would walk into the spotlight together, no matter how blinding it might be. The charity gala unfolded inside the grand hall of the Waldorf Astoria, where the crystal lights rained down like thousands of gleaming blades. Outside, reporters crowded the entrance, cameras flashing nonstop, ready to capture every frown, every forced smile. For Edward Hamilton, the entire space was nothing short of a public arena. He entered alongside Isabella Carter, dressed in the same minimalist yet elegant black gown. She walked calmly beside him. Edward's breath was quicker than usual, but with each step, he forced himself to keep the pace, like a man bracing for the storm. Daniel Hamilton emerged at the center of the hall, dazzling in his tuxedo, microphone clenched firmly in his hand. His voice rang out, polite yet sharp, like the edge of a finely honed blade. "Thank you all for joining us tonight. This is not just a charity event, but also an occasion for the Hamilton family to prove our integrity and honor." The guests applauded, some glancing toward Edward, anticipating the drama to come. Daniel turned, his smile curling. "And I believe nothing speaks louder than the truth revealed here and now." An attendant carried out a black case and placed it on the podium. Daniel unlocked it, pulling out a thick file, raising it high under the lights. "These are documents concerning Carter Enterprises. Many of you have wondered about the collapse of this company and its connection to my family." A ripple of whispers spread. Camera flashes burst across the room. Edward felt his throat tighten, but Isabella laid a gentle hand on his arm, her gaze steady. "Let me handle this." Daniel opened the file, his voice deliberate, each word echoing. "These records show that Richard Carter recklessly signed risky contracts, driving the company into ruin. My family merely withdrew our investments in time. If anyone insists on placing blame, let it be clear not every mistake belongs to someone else." The crowd murmured. Some nodded, others frowned. Daniel closed the file, his smile triumphant. But then, Isabella stepped forward. Her voice was calm, not loud, yet enough to silence the entire room. "You forgot a few pages from that file. Daniel, the ones with the signatures. The hall erupted. She pulled out a smaller folder from her handbag and raised it. The lights caught familiar names and signatures. Here are contracts drafted by your family's own lawyers, forcing Richard Carter into unfair terms. And here is a recording of the meeting where you plotted how to corner him into collapse. The room exploded with noise. Some reporters leapt to their feet, brandishing cameras and recorders. Daniel's face drained of color, his voice breaking. That's fabricated. Edward stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. No, I confirm those signatures are genuine, and I was present in that very meeting. The silence that followed thundered louder than any outburst. A wave of shock rippled through the hall. Guests turned to one another, then fixed their eyes on Daniel. His face was pale, his smile shattered. Isabella set the folder on the table, her voice low but unyielding. The truth cannot stay buried forever. Tonight, everyone has seen it. I did not return for revenge. I returned so justice could be called by its rightful name. At that moment, two security officers entered with a man in a black suit. In his hand was a badge from the authorities. His voice was firm, unmistakable. Daniel Hamilton, you are under arrest for fraud and financial manipulation. For one suspended beat, silence reigned. Then the hall erupted. Cameras flashed wildly. Conversations surged like waves. Daniel struggled, but the cold steel cuffs clamped down, locking away every last excuse. Edward stood motionless, his heart pounding. In the blinding glare of the chandeliers, he saw it clearly. The curtain had fallen, and for the first time, justice stood with those once abandoned. The charity gala ended in aftershocks, but the next morning opened with a different kind of light. On the front pages of the major newspapers, there were no longer sensational, doubtful headlines, but instead hard-hitting lines. The Hamilton family exposed. Signatures and recordings, the undeniable truth. A woman returns from the shadows, the voice of justice. Edward Hamilton sat by the apartment window, watching the morning sun stream through the glass. Inside him was no longer the chaos of the previous days, but a fragile sense of relief just beginning to take root. For the first time, he didn't have to bow his head before his family or pretend to be blind to the truth. Isabella Carter stepped out from the small kitchen, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. She placed one in front of Edward, then sat down across from him. Her shoulders were no longer drawn as tightly as a bowstring, and her eyes carried less of that guarded edge. Perhaps, after everything, the wall around her had cracked, allowing a sliver of light to shine through. Edward spoke softly, his voice low but warm. I used to think justice only existed on paper, in courtrooms. But now I understand that justice lives in every person who dares to stand up, even when the whole world is against them. Isabella smiled, a smile no longer bitter, but touched with peace. And I used to think I had to walk alone forever. But maybe I was wrong. They looked at each other. The silence between them was no longer heavy, but a place to lean on. Outside, the world was still noisy, but inside this room, they found a fragile, genuine peace. Edward reached out and took her hand. From here on, you won't be alone. Those words didn't echo like an empty promise, but as the declaration of a new beginning. If you're listening to this story, take a moment to ask yourself in your own life, have you ever stood at a difficult crossroads where truth and courage confronted fear and silence? What did you choose? Share your personal story in the comments. Sometimes a single line shared can become a light to guide someone else who's lost their way. If you feel something from today's story, don't forget to subscribe, share this video with your friends, and journey with the soft why. Here, every story isn't just for listening. It's for us to find strength together, to heal, and to believe that justice, even if delayed, can still arrive. Beyond the window, sunlight stretched across the tall buildings, reflecting like ripples of light. Inside the small apartment, Two people who had once swept into the storm sat beside each other, silent yet deeply understanding. And in that silence, a new chapter began. A chapter of healing, of starting over, of a new family built on truth, not lies.